Hello again, good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Minds on Guard, where we're learning how to guard our minds against all of the manipulations, attacks, and attempts at thought and behavior control that we come under today in the 21st century. Tonight, we are going to dig a little bit deeper into what I see to be an incredibly important topic, which has had a major impact on much of the world today. Last week, we began looking at the topic of subversion, specifically the process by which subversion of a nation or population's psychology is enacted and successfully completed. We looked at a couple of definitions of this term, subversion, as well as a brief introduction of a man named Yuri Bezmenov, who was an ex-KGB agent in the former Soviet Union. Now, during his time in the KGB, Mr. Bezmenov worked on various subversion campaigns in other countries, seeking to slowly infiltrate the previously established system of government and economic activity and shift it to one that was more in line with the Soviet style of communism. After some time of seeing this process play out and the ramifications and consequences of this process, Bezmenov could not continue in his activity in the KGB any longer due to his moral convictions and decided to defect. Now, this was quite a dangerous decision, and it meant that Bezmenov would have to leave his home or risk imprisonment or even death at the hands of the Soviet government. He came to the U.S. under a false name, and after some time here, began speaking publicly about the things that he knew and understood regarding the process of subversion as it was practiced in the former Soviet Union. In this video, we're going to learn about some of that process, and as we go, I want everyone to consider the state of things in our country today. Think of what you see in the news, in movies, and on TV. What sorts of lessons were you taught in school? What subjects were considered most important? Did you grow up in a household with both parents present? What kinds of morals did they raise you to have? Did you go to church as a child? These questions are key to this topic, as most of the process of subversion is carried out in the areas which they attend. The one thing that they all have in common is that these areas are where our inner thinking systems and reasoning skills are developed and honed into what should be a robust, logical, and coherent worldview which is in alignment with the true state of reality. Now, my argument is that we here in America, and I believe in many other countries, have indeed undergone and completed the process of subversion of which Mr. Bezmenov spoke about. The most readily available reason for this conclusion is the rampant attacks on the truth that we all endure every single day from the news and social media. As I've noted in previous videos, we live in the age of spin and are always enduring various psychological operations of one form or another. These are just a part of the overarching subversion process, and, as we have learned, they are quite effective in achieving their goal of thought and behavior manipulation. The more we learn about this process and the tools and tactics that have been used, the better we will be at spotting their presence in today's world. With our minds tuned in to how these attacks are carried out, we can mount a defense of the truth and stand against the attempts at even further subversion, which are most certainly coming. In the last video on this topic, we defined subversion in two ways. First, we said that subversion is understood as a systematic attempt to overthrow or undermine a government or political system by persons working secretly from within. This is done from the foundation in an effort to pervert or corrupt by an undermining of morals, allegiance, or faith of a nation and or its people. This rounds out our dictionary definition well and gives us a solid baseline to help us understand the process of subversion of which Mr. Bezmenov described in various lectures during the 1980s. As we think about the process, it's going to be important to keep the key concepts of the definitions in mind. The main highlights are the attempt to overthrow or undermine, the specific targets of morals, allegiance, or faith, and the fact that this is done secretly from within the system that is being subverted. In his introduction to the lecture of Focus, Bezmenov makes the point that the subversion process is always aimed at the destruction of the country, nation, or geographical region of an enemy. In this way, much like in our discussion on PSYOPs, the subversion process is a type of military operation at its core. The major distinction of this kind of combat is that it is not the typical variety where physical targets like bridges and infrastructure are destroyed. We are instead dealing with the hearts and minds of the people. This means that the methodology will be different from traditional combat. It's a method of combat which Bezmenov likens to the martial art of judo, where the fighter trains to use their attacker's force, weight, and momentum to their own advantage, absorbing the blows in ways which direct the opponent into compromised positions so that they can defeat them without incurring any injury themselves. When done correctly, every attack is directed toward the opposite goal of the attacker. Bezmenov also states that in order for the subversion process to be successful, the target has to want to be subverted. By this he means that the target of the subversion process has to be a responsive one in that they are open to and accepting of outside information from actors who are in opposition to the status quo of the target. Now this may sound simple, but it has implications which hit at very serious issues regarding foreign and domestic policy, as well as the involvement of any nation in the expansion of globalization. Essentially, the more open a society with respect to outside influence, the more of a target they are for ideological subversion. Given this, we can say that the United States has been one of the most vulnerable targets for subversive attacks ever since the end of World War II and the establishment of the United Nations. It's very likely that we have been targeted for many years before that. In our study on the deterioration of American education, we learned that the infiltration of the school system by people who wanted to implement an ideological system which removed the concept of the human soul, and by extension their intrinsic value and distinct worth, began as early as the late 1800s. Men like John Dewey, Edward Thorndike, and the methods of response-reward education are just one of these subtle subversion tactics which are used in the overall process. Bezmenov speaks about a four-step process which makes up the overall concept of subversion. These steps have clear definitions and time frames in which they are typically carried out. The first step is called demoralization, followed by destabilization, then crisis, and finally normalization. This is the subversion process, and when executed in the ways that Bezmenov articulates, it has very high success rates. What I want to focus on for the rest of this video is the first step, demoralization. Bezmenov states that this stage is carried out over a span of approximately 15 to 20 years. Now, why this time frame? Well, that's because that it's approximately the amount of time that it takes for a student to complete their basic school education and to form their ideology, worldview, and their personality. All it takes for a societal shift to occur is to cause a single generation to think about the world and themselves in ways which are hostile to all previous ways of thinking which may have come before. This has been achieved to some of the most disastrous ends, and in fact, we know that it can actually be accomplished in an even shorter time frame, depending on specific factors within the society. In Nazi Germany, for example, it only took 10 years to build up a fighting force in the Hitler Youth that was fiercely loyal to the agendas of the Third Reich. What began in 1922 culminated in the kinds of ideological subversion which led to complete destabilization and war across the globe. What needs to be recognized here is that the primary target of the first stage of demoralization is the youngest minds of any generation that is being subverted. This is done by undermining the foundational institutions of culture, which have been long understood to ensure a thriving and prosperous society. The word demoralization tells us all that we need to know about what goes on. Throughout the education of this target generation, every single area of life which is tied to a fundamental notion of morality is going to be undermined. This means that ideas like intrinsic human value, humility, submission to the will of God, differentiation between right and wrong, and the fundamental belief in truth are all attacked and made to be seen as meaningless, arbitrary, or non-existent. When a society has no sense of right and wrong and cannot discern truth from lies, there is no amount of psychological or behavior manipulation that anyone can hope to mount a defense against, because all of the essential tools of defense have been rendered useless. What sorts of thoughts does this leave you with when you think of the kinds of exposure to psychological manipulation that our kids are dealing with every day? Even as young as 2 years old, children are spending hours each day on digital devices which pump constant content aimed at their young minds. And we've learned in previous videos about the dangers of subliminal messaging in digital media technology. These things are happening all the time, and I don't think that we've even begun to see the ramifications of the constant exposure on the youngest people today. Already, very chilling reports of kids in Generation Alpha are coming out regarding their aggressiveness and highly emotional reactivity to even the most harmless of inconveniences. We will need to pay attention to this closely as time goes by. So what are the target areas of the demoralization stage? Bezmenov makes note of 6 major ones: religion, education, social life, power relationships, labor and economic relations, and the area of law and order. He states that these areas are where subversion may be applied to its greatest effect. In the case of religion, the goal is to destroy the generally accepted faith of a society by slowly eroding the essential nature and dogmas of that religion and replacing it with fake religions which have no connection to the divine. When it comes to education, the goal is to move away from traditional subjects like mathematics and science and replace them with things like health studies or home economics. We have discussed this one in our series on education. In the area of social life, the goal is to replace genuine human connection amongst people with various facades which imitate genuine person-to-person communication. Now, social media is the prime example here. In the area of power relationships, the goal is to replace people who had previously been elected to hold positions of power and influence with groups or individuals who are unelected and have been given power simply due to their financial influence or some other factor. The mainstream media machine and the non-governmental organizations that we see running the world today are prime examples of this. Also, the various think tanks and philanthropic organizations fall into this. In the area of law and order, we see the undermining of positions of authority through the circulation of images and symbols which depict police officers as cold-blooded killers rather than people who are there to protect us. Also, military officers are shown to be robotic soldiers meant for war rather than the defense of our nation and its people and values. While at the same time, criminal activity is celebrated and romanticized in movies and television in more ways than we can quantify here. And finally, in the case of labor and economic relations, the traditional notion of fair exchange for goods and services is replaced with an ideology which emphasizes only power dynamics. Those who have resources are considered oppressors, while those who do not are the oppressed. As such, equality of outcomes must be forced, and no amount of merit, skill, investment, time, risk, or any other fair and balanced metric for exchange is tolerated, as it may just be seen as another form of oppression. When all of these areas are put through this kind of subversive undermining, every moral fiber which once held a society together is frayed to the point of breaking apart. Now, these are only some examples to show how this first stage of demoralization happens, which eventually leads to the second stage of the process, destabilization. We will pick up there in the next video in this series. So until then, stay safe, stay diligent, and stay vigilant, keeping your minds on guard.